Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of Gehenna Gaming Interviews, live from Virtual Horror Con 2022. I am your host, Ian E. Muller, and today I am joined by the creator of Liminal Horror, a rules light fail forward system for fans of Junji Ito, Cosmic Horror, Call of Cthulhu, Monster of the Week, and Silent Legions, as well as the writer of the scenario The Bureau, which we aired a actual play yesterday as part of the convention. Josh, and I should have asked you this before I said it, but it's too late now. Domanski?
Yep, nailed it.
Yes, perfect. Got it in one. All right. So before we jump in, I just want to give you a chance to tell people who you are, and a little bit more about kind of your background in the TTRPG industry. Goblin Archives, I want to start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'm Goblin Archives. I wrote Liminal Horror, and I got to co-write The Bureau with Josh. And I'm also just putting out a module called The Mall that Josh is actually going to actual play later today for Virtual Horror Con. And yeah, so my involvement was just writing this system, which is a hack of Cairn, and we'll talk probably a bit more about what that is. And then slowly realizing that I just wanted to develop adventures for it and support the system. And so that's really the world in which I work in, is liminal horror adventures, trying to support and build a community and sort of like build it out. Yeah, I think I'll stop right there.
And Josh.
Yeah, so I'm Josh. I guess I consider myself an adventure writer, but I do a lot of like layout and design work. I primarily like mess around with the smaller scope type of projects. We're talking like pamphlet adventures, little one-pagers. Those are usually my bread and butter, but in the past year or so, I've kind of been branching out to a little bit longer zines. Like was mentioned, I was the co-writer and the design work for The Bureau, which again we streamed last night. And then I also co-wrote and did the design work for Zen 2 Nauts, which is an OSE release that came out last fall, and I've got a couple other things coming out in the future as well.
Awesome. So before we jump into really talking about liminal horror itself and the scenarios that you have written, what was your first introduction to tabletop RPG? Josh, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Yeah. So I had what was now, I guess, the very classic route to get into, the scene. I didn't really start playing until, relatively recently, in the grand scheme of things. Like I grew up in a Rust Belt town. I was a giant Star Wars nerd. But the thing was, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, at least I'm not as nerdy as those D&D guys. Not really knowing what any of it was about outside of what the popular media was about it at that time. But then I ended up getting like really into like video games. That was like my thing for years until I became an adult and I can't play them anymore. And so there was, you have your big voices in the video games, your Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, Travis Willingham, Laura Bailey. And so I'm like following them all on social media, and then I see everybody's talking about this Critical Role thing. And so I'm like, what the heck is this? And so I check it out, and this is back in like 2016. And I'm like, oh, I like this.
Nice.
So I went through a bit of a renaissance there. I don't really watch Critical Role anymore at this point, because again, I don't have time. But I ended up working for a company in starting in 2018 for my day job, where after watching, APs and stuff for years, I actually got invited to join something. So my first actual like tabletop session was 10 Candles on Halloween in 2018.
Nice. That's a great game to play on Halloween.
Yeah.
Talking about that. Goblin Archives.
I have a very interesting sort of introduction to tabletop RPGs, in that I ran games long before I ever got to be a player.
Same.
So growing up, huge sci-fi fantasy book reading, just like read a ton, read a lot of like Forgotten Realms, like D&D kind of things, but never actually got to play. I remember going over to a friend's house and seeing 3.5 and reading the text, reading the book. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Never got to play. And then it wasn't until I was like 25 years and years later that I had friends who were like, hey, let's play D&D. And so then I got the starter kit. So mine's a Fandelver, and like read all the books. The only person in the whole group to read all the books, by the way. Like no one else decided to read the rules. They just relied on me for them. And I ran games and just ran. And we had years long and would have a pretty open table so people could join in and not. And like sometimes as many as 8 people, which now I'm like, I don't know if I could run a table of 8 people, but back then I definitely could. And then years and years later, and then finally I was able to be a player. But my first introduction to RPGs was running them. And I think that is why, to me, being able to run things for people is like a gift. I try to always, if I work with people, like, hey, can I run a game for you?
So both of you kind of getting your start with Dungeons and Dragons, now branching out into indie TTRPGs with horror. What drew you to creating your own game and kind of working in the indie TTRPG?
So I definitely transitioned out from sort of trad gaming as I was like, I guess friends at the table I listened to a lot, and they introduced me to a lot of different types of games. And so then I sort of followed that path along of like, hey, let's do some Powered by the Apocalypse, and ran a ton of that, like the Sprawl and just massive campaigns with like great stories and that, and realizing more and more I liked things where there were less rules so we could focus on the actual play and narrative. Sometimes when things get overly complex, which can be a lot of fun, but when things get overly complex, it can sort of take the focus to that. And I started to like, and then I found Into the Odd, Electric Bastionland, and Mothership, and those are the two things I primarily run now. I also run a ton of Liminal Horror as well, but the actual act of making games was listening to creators on the Lost Bay podcast and listening to them talk about their process and realizing, wait a minute, I could do this. I'm doing this amount of work when I write adventures. And then finding Cairn, and then realizing sort of that there wasn't a modern, there wasn't like that much of a modern set OSRE Into the Odd system. And then it sort of stumbled from there. I wrote it in like 3 days.
Nice. Yep. You mentioned Into the Odd. You saw the recent Re-League?
No.
Re-League is released.
Oh yeah. The remaster.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is super exciting. The Into the Odd. Actually, I played Electric Bastionland first, and like if you can get your hands on that, it's definitely worth, just from an art book standpoint. The rules themselves are actually only like 3 pages.
I feel like that's
got some of the best advice for game masters and creating a world in the back of that book, though. Like that is something for the collection, you know.
Truly, like I don't see a need to write a lot of advice when I could just point people to like certain essays he has in the back.
Chris McDowell,
who wrote it. High recommend. It's worth the price point. Even if you can't get the physical copy, get the PDF and read all of the back matter. Awesome. It'll make you a better GM, make you a better designer for sure.
Awesome. Josh, what about you? What drew indie RPG?
Yeah, so the group that I was running for, like I said, back in 2018 was kind of when I got my start. We were primarily doing D&D 5th edition, but we were never like an agnostic group. That's not the right word. We were an agnostic group where when it was all my coworkers, so the schedules were never really all that great, and so we could barely keep a campaign going. But in those interstitial sessions, when a couple people showed up, we would do like, you know, Dungeon World Monster of the Week for the Queen, stuff like that in there. But the big thing is I pretty quickly after joining started running a campaign for 5th edition D&D and burnt myself out. Like I was doing everything custom. It ended up being kind of like I made a lot of GM's first mistakes on that campaign. Oh, I froze. Am I back? I froze for a sec.
No, you're good.
Okay. But what I was doing for that campaign was everything was custom. World was done. I was trying to do like, I think, subclasses. I custom built every encounter, just maps. I did all this crap, and it was too much, you know. And I even went into GIMP and like hand drew with my mouse a custom map for the area that we were using and all that. So I got to the point where it's like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I just don't have time for it. And I stumbled into, well, one, the Cypher system by Money Cook Games, which is like, that was such a breath of fresh air compared to like 5th edition D&D. And I'll go for back to that system any day. But the real kicker was in the summer of 2020, Tuesday Night Games and the Whisper Collective put out this book that's called Dissonant Whispers. It's an adventure anthology that it's about 62-page adventures for a, oh, there we go.
There we go.
It's a bunch of like, you know, OSR and OSR adjacent systems. And that is one of my favorite pieces of tabletop content, like bar none. Because I had copies of Mothership. I hadn't really played it at that point. And so I was still into it. I was getting into like the scene. I saw they put out the Dissonant Whispers, or they were doing it. I was sort of following that along. That book introduced me to Electric Bastionland, to Merkborg, to Troika, to a whole bunch of stuff. And that just sort of spiraled out into, you know, getting into the scene and wanting to be a part of it in a creative way.
Awesome. I like learning people's backgrounds coming in as well as their creation of it. So we kind of covered this in the previous answer, but what inspired you to start making a game versus working within other systems? And specifically, what was your inspiration to move into horror game? Start with Josh.
Okay, sure. So like I said, I ended up getting a lot of my initial like introduction to the scene through that Dissonant Whispers book. And the thing was, it was produced by Tuesday Night Games, but that was all creators that coming together and collectively working. Or it was like 2 weeks where they put this whole thing together. And that itself ended up spawning like a whole bunch of smaller like little work groups who were putting out, you know, Mothership content, just like some of the best stuff you can find in the indie scene just spiraled out of that book. But the real thing was so that book got me to start running, you know, rules light OSR systems. I ended up starting with Troika and then getting into Electric Bastionland, just running sessions. I was doing, I still technically do this, but weekly one-shots, rotating systems and adventures, primarily starting pulling out of that book. And so it got to the point where it was like, I'm starting to make custom things. I want like maps and whatnot. And I'm watching Chris McDowell on YouTube talk about Electric Bastionland. And he starts using this program that's called Affinity. I'm like, that's interesting. So I buy Affinity. And so I start tinkering and I'm like, oh, okay, I like this. And my day job, I work as an environmental engineer, which means I do a lot of report writing and I do a lot of figure creation. So there's like maps and stuff about environmental sites that we go on. So I have this, you know, like background in, it's not graphic design by any means, but, you know, using programs to create visual aids for engineers. And so I kind of took to Affinity pretty quickly. I wouldn't consider myself a pro, you know, at this point. And then I started making stuff for just myself or Electric Bastionland to give to my players to make it easier. And then there was a game jam on itch.io for Merkborg. And I was like, I'm just going to do something real quick. And I call it an art piece. I wanted to take adventure, put it on one page and abstract absolutely as much as possible while still making something coherent.
Okay. What was the piece you released from Morkborg?
Oh God, let me see what I called it. It's been a while. It's been a couple of years.
No worries. While you're at Goblin Archive, you.
So I had mentioned. So I was listening to the Lost Bay, and hearing creators talk about, and it sort of inspired me to be like, hey, I could do this too. Like Josh, I had pre-bought an Affinity designer and publisher because I had wanted to learn layout. I was just graphic design had been a thing that had always interested me. I think it's so cool, but it's something I had zero knowledge about. So I had the program. I was like, wait a minute, if I write a game, it could be an excuse to learn the program I bought. Then finding Cairn and the Creative Commons licensing it has, which allowed me to really just like use a ton of it, all of it really. I had the framework and I had the tools, and then it took me thinking about sort of what would be worth taking the time to fill the space in. And when it finally clicked that I should do modern horror, I wrote it super fast. I wrote the draft of it in like I said, 3 days, like 3 days straight, just writing, and then sent it out to friends and slowly started to hone it in that 3 days. And then I got it all taught myself how to lay out and did it all pretty quickly. I think horror, though, why I shifted to horror is it wasn't actually a thing I was very big into growing up. I loved sci-fi and fantasy, but I think as I've gotten older and listening to a lot of horror narrative podcasts, right? Like Magnus Archives, the White Vault, just like a ton of other things I'm like started to get into in short horror fiction, which is like right now there's a renaissance in short horror fiction, small publishers. I could sit and talk for days about go look up Filthy Loot Publishing and just buy everything off of Filthy Loot. But started to realize that that is themes I really enjoy, and realizing when I ran games, the horror aspects to me brought up my most favorite moments.
Yeah, there we go.
Filthy Loot, like literally just buy everything off of them. But and realize that horror moments in play elicited my favorite narrative moments and character moments, and realizing that if I build and play in horror structures, it can create the events at the table that I really enjoy. So less power fantasy, more like let's explore how these characters change. In horror, it does a really good job of eliciting that.
I agree 100%. Shocker, I know. So shifting gears now, I want to talk more about Liminal Horror itself. Tell people about Liminal. What is the game? Sit down and you pick up the book. What should people expect from it?
People should expect you can explain it really fast. The rules fit on 1-page rules reference. There are 3 stats: strength, dexterity, control, and you roll under them. If I want to do something that there's a risk, I roll against my own stat. And that's a more technical aspect. The kind of play that happens is the way I designed Liminal Horror was you start as relatively normal people. And as they get exposed for one way or another to like the abyss or magic or whatever you have specifically for your table, they start to change. I didn't want it to be necessarily that there's a big organization, even though we wrote the bureau where there is one. The thing about Liminal Horror, as I've realized, is it's really adaptable to different horror genres. But play itself is focused on characters that start to change, and by the end can be drastically different than the way they started. And that's a mechanical as well as narrative. There's a thing called fallout that as things happen to them, instead of doing the way Cthulhu systems tend to have sanity, I really wanted to avoid stigmatizing mental health impacts. That was a huge thing for when I wrote this. I was like, I didn't really want to have that aspect of, oh, your mind breaks, or, oh, you develop sort of this mental health impact. So instead, the things that happen to you are, there's like these narrative hook changes, like a crown of tar, dripping tar appears over your head and only some people can see it. Like narrative hooks that you could then continue sessions on.
Nice.
And our characters change and they become more and more closer to like whatever is the weird, and less normal. Also, you'll notice that I don't want people to be playing cops. I think any piece of media that you have as a cop, you could have as an investigative journalist.
Yeah.
That's also just a personal preference. I don't think it's as interesting to be oppressors in the system.
That valid, ACAB. We had an interesting conversation around regarding that recently.
Yeah.
Similar
and
feeling.
it's like when we were writing the bureau, kind of on that angle, it's centered around a federal bureau that investigates the paranormal. There are options to we called them operational experience, just to kind of like fit a tone, but they're basically just your character backgrounds that give you a couple items and like some story hooks that you can pursue if you so choose. You can play as agents of the bureau, but the one thing that we're very explicit about at the start of that module is that the bureau is not good. It is they're not necessarily actively working against the interest of humanity, but they certainly aren't acting in the betterment of it.
Right. Speaking of the bureau, you also have a scenario that you're running later today called the Mall. As you mentioned, Goblin Archives, Liminal Horror fits a wide variety of. You can run it with a bunch of different themes. Mall is a callback to The Thing, set in a 90s shopping mall. The Bureau is very SCP, X-Files, like organization that runs the Cabin in the Woods. Those are the vibes I got from it. What was the catalyst that led to making the game fit so many different subgenres of horror as opposed to being a cosmic horror?
So I think when I went in to design it, I wrote it without a distinct tie to any like mythos or any specific genre, even though it bills itself as cosmic horror. And I talk about like the abyss and the other. Truly, it could adapt from the baseline to any mythos that you wanted to choose, because I didn't want to pigeonhole anyone into things. You'll look in the monsters in the back, and it's pretty much just callbacks to all my favorite. There's the Magnus Archives, a couple of them from there. There's one from the Resident Evil Village. So I just wanted it to be pretty open. And then what I started to realize as I thought of how do I make content for this game, because I wanted to support it. I like to watch a movie or have a touchstone, and then I'll write something that I'm inspired by that. And so that's why I said The Thing in malls. And what I've realized is that the Liminal Horror chassis is pretty modular in and of itself. And so if you change character creation, and if you adapt character creation specifically to the theme, and you adapt the fallouts to the theme, you can reinforce pretty much any horror genre. And so for the Mall, I knew pretty much when I was writing Liminal Horror, I wanted to write something that was The Thing because it's my favorite movie. And I thought setting it in setting it in a mall would be really interesting because malls are like a modern dungeon.
Yep.
And as that idea gestated, I started to create module rules. So for the mall specifically, there's a thing called whisper cards, which are these cards you give to players that even the GM doesn't see. And it gives prompts that inspire people to act in sort of horror movie ways.
Yeah.
And there are cards that say you've been replaced. You are the monster, and that person is the only one who knows that, not the GM,
Amazing.
not the other people at the table. And it creates this paranoia as I see Josh has a huge stack of whisper cards, and he's doing some weird stuff, and I'm like, are they replaced? Are they in my best interest? And it's like, how do I push players to have an interesting experience? The malls doesn't. I've maybe had like one person end up surviving. Like there's some I could go on kind of all the different play tests. Liminal Horror is definitely not a game to play if you hold your characters sacred and want them to survive.
I am a big fan of that. Two games. So Josh, switching over to the Bureau, then what was the inspiration behind that scenario?
So there are two catalysts. I joke around saying that these are things that changed my life, but I mean, not really. So in 2019, a video game came out from Remedy Entertainment called Control. Now, Control was if someone took everything I was ever interested in terms of video games, plucked it from my brain, and made a whole thing out of it. And so it was like I was in from the moment I saw the first trailer, and then the game came out, and it's a little janky. It's a little. It doesn't.
It's the same studio that made Alan Wake, which is my favorite games.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it has its flaws. I haven't actually played Control yet. I just want to preface
I
that so
would.
you don't spoil anything for me because it's on my
No, it's
list.
fine. I would highly recommend it. It's so the thing is Remedy made it with like $30 million or something like that. Like they had 505 Games publish it. They basically just did it all themselves. 505, isn't a traditional publisher in the way like EA or Activision is. And so again, you run into a little bit of janky stuff, but it's just like the world is so like in depth. There's just so much stuff to uncover there, and all like the tie-ins and whatnot as you go through it. And again, I won't get into spoilers, but
But no,
um,
it's the game I've ever read like the appendices when I'm playing every entry. Like that's something I never did, but like you find it and you sit and read.
Nice.
yeah, and then so like that was before I was in design space, but that's one of those things where I think about Control all the time. Like that game stuck with me. And then so it kind of like goes into the path of uh the Mothership tabletop RPG. Mothership, I hadn't really been playing it. I think this was even before the Dissonant Whispers book, but the Tuesday Night Games put up this Kickstarter for something called Gradient Descent. And I was like, I don't really know what this is. At that point I really didn't know what Mothership was. I had it. I don't think I really read it, but I was like, oh, these are the creators. I'll kickstart this. So I kickstarted. In the interim, I learned what Mothership was. I started playing it. And then the book comes out. And again, this is one of those things where somebody reached into my brain and pulled something out and put it on the paper. And it's like, so Gradient Descent is this abandoned android facility out in the middle of space. It's like a mega dungeon in and of itself. There's 6 levels. There's just all this like crazy stuff that goes on in it. And the big thing is the layout is exactly the way I like to run games. So it's just, little line of theater, like box text, if you want to call it that, couple bullet points to explore, and a simple map on the page. So you open it up, everything you need is right there. And it's all fine-tuned. The writing, it's very terse, but it's very well written. And so my brain was like, there are these 2 things that I really like. Let's smash them together and make a module. So
Very
the
cool.
bureau is the way the tagline is. It's control meets gradient descent. Like I wanted to take that, simplify gradient descent down a little bit. My original goal was 32 pages. We ended up with 40, I think.
Yep.
Just because I don't really run long campaigns. I run either one shots or what I call episodic campaigns, which are like max 10 sessions. And so I wanted to like simplify it, get the themes down, tie it up in about 10 sessions worth of content on the long end.
So Liminal Horror is described as a rules-light, fail-forward system for fans of Junji Ito, Cosmic Horror, Call of Cthulhu, to the Weak Battle Legion. I said earlier. What is a fail-forward system?
So I've seen that term a lot. I guess what really embodied that, I had to go look up exactly what the talk was called, but Austin Walker gives a talk at Panoma University, at Panoma College, called Failure as an Engine for Meaning Making. That really stuck with me. But I think fail forward to me is that the way, and I allude to this in when we have the principles for facilitators and principles for players at the very beginning of the book. Our goal is to tell an interesting story and push the story forward. And sometimes that comes at the cost of our characters. And to enjoy, and this is a game that's built to be enjoyed for people when their characters take risks or do something that us as the characters know is not the right choice. Us, the players, know is not the right choice, but the character might think it's a good one. Leaning into that horror, leaning into that like fail forward. Also, this idea that if I make a roll, like let's say I'm trying to open a door, to me, the least interesting part of a game ever is, oh, I failed the DC. You don't do anything. The narrative never moves. And that to me has always not felt good as a player. Of like, I want to pick this lock and oh, you failed, nothing happens. To me, I wanted to create something that really pushes people to say, okay, if there is a failure, the story should still move forward. Risk needs to be involved. So it explicitly says in the text, for me, for everyone, ignore as much of the text as you want. Make the game yours, make the adventures yours, except for, to me, I think that you should only roll if there's an interesting result to failure. If there's not, just have it happen.
Yeah.
Just have the character do it. Just like, if it's not going to be interesting if they fail, like, just do it. Like, oh yeah, you kicked the door in. If there's nothing, like no time pressing, there's no monster at the other side. If we're just like having enough time to kick this door in, just do it.
Yep.
So that idea that failure should push should push the story forward, and us as players sometimes want our characters to fail because it's interesting. And I guess that's where I place a lot of my enjoyment in games.
I am 100% on board with that ethos. That conversation we have a lot with. We run our creative director Dan. The name of his personal channel is Nat1 Failure. Some of the interesting and exciting experiences and systems that I think excited to try that, because as we mentioned, I haven't actually gotten a chance to play Liminal Horror because unfortunately for me, sitting in the production seat for stuff, but I will.
Hey, if you
very much
have some time next weekend, there's the Exalted Funeral Convention. We're going to try and arrange some games at some point. We haven't got the schedule complete yet, but keep an eye out. You might have a chance to play Liminal Horror that's not related to a stream.
I definitely will, and that goes to everyone else. So this is a very nebulous question, but be interesting, and touched on pieces of it, like you said. Liminal first draft took great. What is your process for game development? Spend a lot of time thinking about like the mechanics and the nitty-gritty stuff, or is it kind of more here are the stories I want this system to tell? Let me like give people all of that more ethereal concept work, and then here's a mechanical set that you lay on there. And you mentioned that this is a kind of a hack of Cairn. I'd love to.
So I'll do a quick little bit, and then I'll pass to Josh to talk about adventures. Sure. For game development, I think if someone listening right now is like, hey, I want to write a game, I think writing a hack is a phenomenal way. And when we say a hack, it's you take the rules that are already developed by someone and you adapt them and make your own, sometimes mash things together. You'll notice most of the content I now do is adventures for Liminal Horror, and each one tends to add like a supplemental rule to reinforce a theme that can be used or not. To me, I loved choosing Cairn which is a descendant of Into the Odd, Electric Bastion, and Knave, because I know these rule systems work. So I took something I knew works, been vetted a ton, I've seen and played, and then tweaked it only a little bit and added things on top of. Some people love to create completely new rules and build things from the ground up, and like good on them for that. My interest more lies on like how I can get to the table fastest. And so I'll develop or change small rules and supplemental rules. I have a ton of supplemental rules for Liminal Horror that you could just add on that reinforce a theme or like a play loop that I want in play. But on a whole, I think choosing something that works and then making it work for you is super key. Josh?
Yeah, and so one of the things I like to say is that I don't design systems. I am intentionally a adventure designer. And the thing is, you have to approach that in a little bit of a different manner. I think the key point I would say is I only write things that I want to run. If I'm interested in something, that passion is going to be the thing that carries me through the project to complete it. And so the thing is like when you start, the very first time you say I want to write an adventure, you don't really need to think about the system yet. it's more important to get your initial ideas sort of fleshed out, like your one-page treatment. All right, so for the bureau, I want to take, gradient descent and the control and smash them together. That's a start. And the thing is when I started putting this together, I came to Goblin Archives with a pitch that was, just a couple of pages that was kind of along those lines. So you get your idea together, and then maybe you can start thinking about system. If you're going to write something that's D&D 5th edition, one of the things is I like to subscribe to the whole systems don't matter philosophy, which is a whole thing that I'm not going to bother getting into. But systems
What,
are
you don't want to
important.
do discourse right now?
Yeah, I don't want to do this first. Systems are important, but systems don't matter. But the thing is so if you want to write a horror adventure, I want this to be scary. You do have to consider in the end what you're going to write it for, because you can write horror for D&D 5e, something like that, something mechanically complex. It just might not be the best way to do it.
Yep.
Character with 100 hit points isn't going to be threatened by a goblin with a dagger. So yeah, looking at like liminal horror specifically, there weren't a whole lot of strictly modern role-playing games that at least I was familiar with at the time. So I had run a session. I ran Luca Rayek's Adventure Let Us In. It was over Halloween. I think I did it with my group, and I was like, all right, I really like Into the Odd. I really like liminal horror so far with what I've seen. It's a really great adaptation. So we can kind of take all these ideas and bring them together into one and kind of spiral out from there.
Awesome. This is a specific question for Goblin Archives. In your day job, you work station. And how has that influenced how you write both games mechanically for liminal horror, but also scenarios and things?
So I think, Josh had talked about being an engineer and how some of those skills transition over. I think it's the same with education. Framing information design around if my intent is for someone to learn something, I have to remove barriers in order for them to be able to learn it, right? Because everyone learns differently or approaches things differently. There's all kinds of different metaphors for like on-ramping, right? Providing a lot of different ramps to get on, different access points. I try to emulate that with liminal horror itself, and then also how Josh and I talked a lot about when we were designing this of like, how do we provide different modes of access for people in order to make it like removing those barriers for people to approach, right? So that can be, I provide liminal horror online for free. We have it as text-based only, and just I'd love, and eventually we'll do audio-based, but just like that, trying to consider when we're looking at either how we wrote this table, how we wrote this floor, or how I present this system, is how can I get it so more people can access it and it's not just tailored to one approach. And so those considerations for being in education, I think I've carried over a lot to my design philosophy. I've noticed that being a good GM has helped me in my teaching, and my teaching has helped me in my GMing. Like they've cross-pollinated, like leading meetings. I don't know if Josh has ever seen this, but there's ways I've led meetings. If I approach it like I'd approach an adventure night, I'm like, oh man, that went really well. How do you keep people engaged? How do you keep pacing working? Like these skills are super transferable between whatever you do in your day job. And so just finding things that like, hey, I do this really well with my day-to-day. How can I transfer this to my GMing or to my design, and back and forth? And I think every job has different skills that you can do that, and it's identifying what those are.
Absolutely. I very strongly agree. I always tell people that if you are a GM, you have a background in project management. Very much so. This is the last like formal question, and then I have some lightning round questions so folks can understand like where you're from a little bit better. But Can you give us really like your elevator pitch for Liminal? Like if you're gonna sell it to someone who's never heard of it before, like, hey, try this game. How do you describe it?
I want to hear Josh do it so I can steal it.
Sorry, I froze up for a few seconds there. Was that past me?
Yes, that was past.
I made a joke and you didn't laugh, and I'm offended. No, I said I want you to do it so then I can steal it. It'd be interesting to hear, since I wrote the system, but you've also worked in it. Like, how would you pitch this to players?
Hold on, I have this written down because I did a pitch yesterday. Here we go. I think some of this is actually still from the ad copy, so. Liminal Horror is a game about investigators navigating a modern world full of terrible and unknowable things that hide in the spaces between, looking for a way in. Outside of outright death, these horrors can have a tangible effect on the characters, and those that survive are often forever changed by the experience.
Nice.
I think that's a good. I would just, if I were to add to elevator pitch, here's a modern horror game that really focuses on the narrative and play, and that is adaptable to your favorite genre of horror.
Nice. I like it. So before we jump out of here, I just want to ask some quick lightning round questions just to fire off, because it'll give people a sense of where you came from with making your game, as well as just more about you. What's your favorite horror?
My favorite horror movie is absolutely Alien.
The Thing. Hands down. The Thing.
Both amazing choices, and two of my favorites as well. Favorite band?
Currently, it is King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
Nice.
I'm gonna say two. I'm a cheater. Currently, it's Gulch and Curabin.
Okay. Favorite book? Novel. Fiction.
Oh man. Damn. Probably Dune, but the big thing is my brain has been spoiled because I read like an asinine amount of the Star Wars novels. So it's like anytime I think about books, it's like, oh shit, Star Wars. But let's say Dune. I really like Dune.
I'm gonna say Bonding by Maggie Seibert, which is a short story collection.
And what is your favorite, not counting obviously Liminal Horror, what is your favorite TTRPG to play? And Mothership. I want to pull that one off the shelf as well, because you've mentioned it so many times.
Damn it.
Outside of those.
I want to say two of them because I think they're both worth shouting out. The first one, I have only played this once and I'm absolutely obsessed, but Trophy.
Yep.
Both Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold. And the other one I wanted to talk about, it's because it's produced my absolute favorite experiences, but I've only played it a handful of times at this point. It's a system called Necronautilus. It's by World Champ Game Co. And it's the basic pitch is you play as semi-corporeal clouds of noxious gas that serve as agents of death in their galaxy-like domain.
Amazing.
But the whole thing is it's the system is all about language and how you use words and how you manipulate language to act as your character. And it's hard to sell in 30 seconds, but it is insane. It's a God, I love every second of it, every session I've played of it.
That sounds very interesting.
I'm gonna cheat again. It's fine. Let's anything by Highland Paranormal Society, Nate Tremay. Those adventures are just great to bring to the table. They are just like a phenomenal designer. I haven't played it, but I know it's good. I'm obsessed with Mouse Ritter and the Estate right now, which is a series of pamphlets for Mouse Ritter, which is sort of cheating because it's the same lineage as Liminal Horror, but you're mouse adventurers instead of paranormal investigators. And then if I had to choose a thing I've ran, Electric Bastionland. Just the quirky horror of this land where there's Muppets and robots and aliens, and you're just in a post-industrial mega city is just the most fun.
Listen, every game needs.
It proves that a session where you get to role play as a Muppet and totally throw your characters through a loop is just the best.
Absolutely. 100% agree. As someone who has played in a game, the April Fool's game for our Vampire the Masquerade game, the storyteller pulled out a Muppet and ran the entire game as a Muppet. It was amazing. And traumatizing in some ways.
If you can turn me in post into a Muppet, I'd appreciate it.
I will do my best. I will do my best. All right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining me this morning. My time, it's morning. Before I let you go, are there any other projects other than Liminal Horror, which I will include links to in this, that you want to let people know about, or where can people find you online? Starting with Goblin.
I guess I'll start because I have something kind of bigger coming out.
Yeah.
So I have my hand in a few different baskets. One of them is so the Bureau launches July 15th. Physical copies. You can get digital copies now. That's coming out for Exalted Funeral Summer Sale. I also have a second adventure coming out for the summer sale for Old School Essentials. This one is called Tangled. And what it is we took the concept of the funnel, which is popularized by Dungeon Crawl Classics, and morphed it over to Old School Essentials and wrote an adventure for it. So Tangled is all about you. It's this one. It's a sister adventure, we're calling it, because I'm working with the Afterthought Committee on it, and we wrote Zen 2 Naughts back in the fall, and Zen 2 Naughts was OSE but alien abduction. You play as farmers grabbed and pulled into an alien ship and trying to survive and do a whole funnel there. And so Tangled is kind of returning to form. We're making it it's a dungeon, but there is this encroaching mass of plant life that has burst forth from the dungeon and is slowly engulfing a nearby town. So the concept is you're taking your farmers and so on and trying to fight back this massive overgrowth in the heart of a dungeon.
Awesome.
But that also comes out on July 15th. But folks can find me online on Twitter. I go by Unenthuser. That's unenthusiastic user smashed into one. You can find me on itch.io under the same name, so itch.io/unenthuser. And on Discord, I go by Offended Defender, so I'm a little harder to find, but that's all one word. And I'm in a few different servers, so most of the time folks can track me down if they want to.
Awesome.
Okay, so I have no projects in the wings. That's actually not true, but we have for July 15th, right? We have the Bureau coming out, and then I have the Ball also premiering in print during the same summer sale. And so I'm at this point right now where I don't have the next project super deep in it. But the thing I've been working on and probably will be the next one is a collection of either pamphlets or really short adventures that revolve around a coastal town called Bay Ocean, which was actually a real town in Oregon that sort of fell into the ocean. And I think I'm calling it the Field Guide to Doom. And what it's going to be is a series of different adventures that you could literally push pin on a map. I actually have a big map of Oregon and Bay Ocean back here, and you can push pin in the characters, and tables can go and do different pamphlet adventures around like, why is all this weird stuff happening in this area? And each one is going to be probably based on a 70s, 80s, 90s horror film.
Awesome.
So like I just watched Haunted School, which is a 90s Japanese horror film set about these kids lost in a school. And I sat and what I do is I watch films and I just take notes of different beats and things that like really strike me. And I'll probably just do a different pamphlet adventure based on my inspiration from each of these horror films. So
awesome.
We'll see. And that'll slowly trickle out and then hopefully be collected together, but who knows how long that'll take.
Sounds great. Well, thank you both for joining me, and thank you everyone who watched, listened, etc. And we will see you next time.